I'm Kelly Siegler, and I was a prosecutor for over 21 years. I'd been involved in more than 200 trials, around 60 murder cases, and 20 death penalty cases. Hello, Rhonda.
Hey, Kelly, how are you?
Good, how are you? The prosecutor is the voice for the victim and for their loved ones in that courtroom. My job is to seek justice. And when you meet the victim's family, it's really easy to know who you're getting justice for.
What did that feel like, watching him take his last breath, dying before your eyes?
We were taught at our office that your courtroom is your living room. And anytime we can reenact and show exactly what we think happened to the victim, we do that.
She turned that bedroom into a torture chamber, that bed into a butcher block.
In 2004, I tried the case of the murder of Jeffrey Wright. During the trial, I brought the brutalness of the crime into the courtroom, where all of these injuries in the chest area consistent with the knife being held in this direction. To get my point across, I used a tactic that was at the time controversial. It garnered a lot of press and even more criticism. This case changed the course of my career in ways I've never talked about. When my daughter started working as a prosecutor, defense lawyers told her her first day at work, "You know, your mom was wrong what she did in that courtroom." I don't care. I'm glad I did it. I know why I did it. I'm proud I did it. And it was the right thing to do. So here's the bed pieces. Where's the mattress?
They burned it because it was
bad.
That biohazard.
Where's everything else?
Right around the corner.
Oh, come show me. Today I'm at the Harris County Evidence Archives, which is only open to lawyers. The shovel. I didn't remember if we recovered the shovel or not. I haven't seen this stuff in over 20 years, and looking through all this makes me feel like I'm right back in that courtroom all over again. So this knife is different than a typical knife in a murder case because the piece is missing. State's Exhibit 65, and that's the piece that's found embedded in Jeffrey's skull. I wanted the jury to have a true picture of the injuries. Look how few are on his back. So that's how you know he was tied down the whole time. This tells the whole story of the torture. The night that this case began started like any other night, but it quickly changed into a case that none of us involved would ever forget.
On a Saturday evening, a defense attorney came into the district attorney's office during non-public hours and said they could find a dead body in the backyard of the house at this address.
It's really unusual for a defense lawyer to report a crime. He doesn't identify who the person is, but we all figured out pretty quickly that the reason Neil Davis was the reportee was probably because he was representing somebody that had something to do with why that body was in the backyard.
The people that lived at 10822 Berry Tree Drive were Jeff and Susan Wright and their 2 children. This is a middle-class neighborhood. It's midnight. We're using flashlights to try to light that area up and see.
When they looked inside the patio portion, they saw the head and shoulder of what they believed to be a male subject.
You see an arm, part of a hand, and you see it could be a head. The rest of it's buried. In Texas, the body actually belongs to the medical examiner, and we don't touch it until they get there.
I'm looking at this body. There was a ligature, a cloth tied around both of the wrists, and then there was one around one of the ankles. And I could see there was a massive amount of stab wounds to the front side of his body. I was surprised at how much violence had gone on there. As we were looking at the scene and taking everything in, we noticed a hunting knife. It was near the body in a flower pot. There was a good chance that that was involved in our murder. There were no witnesses at the scene, just constables, officers, and a defense attorney.
I spoke with him briefly. He can't tell me much because attorney-client privilege. I can not remember that ever happening on another scene.
I got a call from Sheriff's Department Homicide, who I worked with a lot, saying, Kelly, we need you to come out to a scene because we have a defense lawyer out here and we need you to run interference while we process the scene and figure out what the heck is going on. Going to a scene in person is something that you never forget. I've never been asked to do that before. I've never been asked to do that since. I mean, I'm used to seeing really, really bad pictures, but I'm not used to seeing it up front and personal, no. When you're a girl prosecutor, mostly working with guys, I remember always thinking, be cool, be strong, be in control, and act like you know what you're doing, even when you don't. There were all these things in the backyard that should have been inside the house. A mattress that was bloody, the sideboards, the headboard, the footboard. It was just chaos.
When they shine a flashlight on the mattresses, we can see dark stains. You think it's blood, but you really can't tell at night. It was saturated.
It hit me right then and there. Somebody needs to show a jury how this bed was used in the commission of this murder. And I asked the crime scene guy to take the bed and store it in the property room.
When you get past the patio, you go into the master bedroom. It's a chaotic scene. Something happened here. This is probably where the murder occurred. The bed is missing. Obviously, the mattress and the box springs belong to that bed.
It looks like a tornado has come through this room. There's all kinds of articles over the floor. There's blood staining.
Blood spatter in various places on the walls. It was on nightstands.
When a stabbing occurs, the first stab, you don't pull blood out when you pull back. It's the second one that goes in, you're pulling blood out, and it'll throw some cast out.
There was some pieces of carpet that had been cut out and taken outside and thrown out there. There was a paint can and a paint roller off to the side on the floor. This appeared to us that somebody was hastily trying to clean up this crime scene.
There's signs of bleaching. People always want to use bleach when they're trying to clean up a crime scene to get rid of the blood.
It looked like a cover-up gone wrong.
When we pull him out of the ground, we think this is Jeffrey Wright.
We didn't know where Susan Wright was. We didn't know where Jeffrey's children were. Did somebody abduct them and kill Jeffrey? There were a lot of unanswered questions.
The media first hears about this murder the next day. Things like this did not happen in this part of Houston, and they did not happen with families like the Wrights. So this instantly had the focus of media from not only Houston and Texas, but around the nation.
I was at work sitting at my desk and the phone rang, and it was our sales rep, and he told me what happened to Jeff. I was just in shock. I just couldn't believe it. He was my friend.
Jeff and Susan Wright, by all accounts, were a happy couple. They were young, beautiful. They had 2 little kids. I mean, they seemed to be living the American dream.
Oh, whiplash! He was a good father, a good family man, was just a good person. Jeff didn't deserve being stabbed.
I start searching out Susan Wright and her family members. And we don't know what role any of them have or what information any of them may have. So several of my partners are out looking for them. They find the home of Susan's parents. They find the home of her sister, but nobody responds to the investigators.
What's going on here? Why won't you let us talk to her? Later, we found out she checked herself into a psychiatric facility.
193 stab wounds.
I've seen all kinds of trials in this town, and this was going to be the trial of the century.
Like you're mad, like you're afraid, like you can't stop.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm going to ask the prosecutor to get back down in the seat.
Jeffrey Wright is brutally, horribly murdered. Where is his wife? Why is she hiding? We didn't know what was going on in the beginning.
Defense attorney Neil Davis informed the Harris County Sheriff's Office that Susan Wright was receiving psychiatric care in a hospital. I believe the children were with Susan's parents at that time.
Why is she in a psych ward? Who put her there? How'd they get her in there? All those questions I didn't have the answers to, and it didn't make any sense.
Susan has not given a statement to the police, and once Neil Davis identified himself as her lawyer, all communications that law enforcement would attempt with her have to go through him by law.
According to the fingerprints taken by the medical examiner's office, the deceased was in fact identified as Jeff Wright. When he's laying on a table, you could see him, and you got this massive amount of stab wounds on his chest, on his abdomen, legs, and groin. 193 stab wounds. The medical examiner was able to locate a piece of metal in the top of his head, which was consistent to the tip of a knife found in a flower pot. They also found some red wax on his legs and on his buttocks.
Whoever committed this murder didn't just kill Jeffrey. There was this nick, not a stab, to his penis and to his eyeball. And those, to me, were the signs of torture. We got into the investigation, and it turns out that 3 days before Jeff's body is discovered, Susan reports Jeff to the police for abusing her and Bradley.
Susan claimed that her and Jeff had had a fight. He had struck their son. She claimed that he had assaulted her and then threw a MasterCard at her for $100 and then walked away from his truck and wasn't coming back, which would explain why his truck was still there.
The Jeff that I knew, he would never abuse his children. He loved them so much.
Finally, we were able to talk to Susan Wright's sister and to Susan Wright's parents and to get confirmation that their children were okay. But we were never able to speak to Susan. The only person doing all the talking on behalf of Susan Wright was Neil Davis, her lawyer.
She has been in psychiatric care. She has been beaten for 4 years, verbally abused. Her son was struck at least twice by the deceased.
Neil Davis's argument to the media is that she's a battered wife, she's abused, and that she had to resort to this level to defend herself and her children from the imminent threat that Jeffrey Wright was.
Got nothing to hide. We're just interested in fairness and justice.
I wasn't terribly surprised that they had to admit she killed Jeffrey, because who in the heck else would have done it? I was more surprised with the way they presented the abuse and why she felt the need to kill Jeffrey.
If you're a battered spouse, your state of mind, based upon continuing chronic systemic abuse, is not going to be the same as any one of us in this room when we're confronted with imminent danger. You may have a different picture of what type of danger is imminent and whether or not your response to use force or deadly force is reasonable.
Well, you have to remember that I grew up in an abusive house. And I lived with the mom that let a man abuse her for way too long. So I was never going to just discount a woman saying she was abused and blow it off. That was not going to happen. But I also wanted the proof.
I took statements from friends and family, and we learned that Susan's family did not like Jeff. They didn't want her marrying him to begin with because he had a possession of marijuana. He had been arrested for theft and a bad check. Her parents had begged her to leave him and take the kids, but no one saw any injuries. There were no written reports or documented incidents for domestic violence.
She also threw in the allegation that Jeffrey used cocaine, and when he did, that would make him more prone to lose his temper and become abusive to her and the kids.
Jeff had cocaine in his system at the time he died. But on all of the interviews that were done with people that knew Jeff was that he was a hard worker, a personable guy, a good provider. He placed his family as a high priority in his life.
In Texas, if you intentionally take somebody's life, that's a murder case. If she was abused, in this situation, this night when the stabbing happened, maybe she could claim self-defense at trial, which would make her not guilty, but she's still going to be looking at murder charges being filed against her.
In this case, the evidence available was a very bloody, brutal crime scene. You were looking at a body that had been stabbed 193 times and buried, disposed of, and hidden. If you're a prosecutor who's been around for longer than 5 minutes, these things are not going to scream out self-defense to
you. You're probably wondering, well, then how did she get those bruises on her hands and fingers when she made her domestic violence report a few days before Jeffrey's body was even found? I think that Susan might have gotten a couple of the bruises from murdering Jeffrey. She might have gotten some of the scratches from the knife she was holding, but I bet she got most of those bruises from taking apart a four-poster bed and dragging a 220-pound body across her bedroom, across her patio, and putting him in that hole. She probably got pretty dinged up doing all that. We know from the medical examiner, Jeffrey was killed on the 13th. I think that after she committed her murder, Susan somehow thought she could make it all go away, tell people that Jeffrey ran off. It looked like a cover-up gone wrong or a big old change in plans because it just got overwhelming. And so the police report that Susan made at the constable's office was on the 15th. Then she hired a lawyer, and then she checked herself into a psychiatric facility to hide out from the police. Susan Wright had supportive parents. Susan Wright had a wonderful sister. Susan Wright is a beautiful, healthy American woman. She could have gotten out. It might have been rough. Jeffrey didn't want a divorce, but that's not an excuse to commit murder.
When charges are finally filed against Susan, Neil Davis does what any good defense attorney would do at that time, which is orchestrate her surrender.
As we are getting ready to go to trial, Susan Wright is out on bond, which is not unexpected. She's just living her life, waiting until time to go to trial. To me, the evidence in this case was pretty clear. Susan Wright murdered Jeffrey. And I need to show a jury how cold-bloodedly and diabolically she tied him up and got on top of him before she started stabbing him. It feels so funny to look at all this stuff because it was such a part of my life 20 years ago. And all of these things are such an important part of the story. In preparing to go to trial, I would have been pretty stupid to not appreciate all of the things that Susan had going for her as a sympathetic defendant.
How could a woman who looks like she could be the prototypical West Houston soccer mom find herself charged with murder, a crime that carries a possible punishment of 99 years or life in a penitentiary?
She's beautiful. She's young. She has a wonderfully supportive family. Most of our murder defendants don't have any of those things going for them, much less all of those things. So what punishment do you give a defendant who looks like her, who claims she was abused? That was always going to be the obstacle and the issue in this case. The only way to counteract that is to make a jury understand, no matter how she looks, what happened in that bedroom that night was the opposite of anything you might ever think this beautiful woman could have done.
Kelly is already very well known within the district attorney's office. She definitely had a reputation with her country accent and her ability to relate to a jury and try tough cases.
Kelly Siegler versus Todd Ward and Neil Davis. The state versus Susan Wright was going to be the Harris County trial of the century.
Hopeful we'll have a jury who will be fair and impartial and will set their emotions aside.
Susan Lucille Wright stabbed and mutilated her husband, Jeffrey Wright, on January 13, 2003. Theirs was not a perfect marriage. The evidence will show you that, but whose is? Susan decided that she didn't want to get a divorce and that her better answer was to just eliminate Jeffrey. She also knew she was going to get a life insurance policy, $200,000. This case is not about self-defense. This case is about selfishness. She put all those wheels in motion way before that horrible night in January.
Die, bitch. Those were the words that Jeffrey Wright told Susan Wright the evening of January 13th, 2003, when he hovered over her in the bed with a knife.
Nobody deserved to suffer the fate that Jeff Wright did. But make no mistake, I think there was a side of Jeff Wright that he did not want others to see. That side existed.
For years before this incident, Jeffrey Wright kicked, pushed, and punched Susan Wright.
I think that marriages where abuse is systemic, women can't leave. Women don't leave. Susan Wright had 2 kids. She had nowhere to go.
They struggle, and she gets the knife, and she stabs Jeff. And she stabs him several times, but she's in such a panic. She thought her husband was still alive. She goes and she gets a necktie and ties his hand to the bed. And she continues stabbing him.
She believed that she had to use not just force but deadly force to repel an attack from her husband that she believed meant the difference between life and death.
How do you claim self-defense when the person you're defending yourself against can't use his hands and he's laying on a bed tied up and he can't move? What are you defending yourself against exactly? I always believed that I had to drive home to a jury and not just tell them about what Susan did in that bedroom that night, but show them.
We had left the bed downstairs in the Special Crimes Division. We had the bed brought up, and the sheriff's investigators put it back together.
You got to make it come alive. You can't just sit in your chair and talk to the witness in the stand and just discuss it theoretically. You got to make it hit home to a jury. Hit them upside the head with it. That's what you have to do. And any prosecutor that doesn't do that is not doing their job. I wanted the jury to go, God, okay, she did that? And you want me to say Jeffrey was a jerk of a husband, therefore excuse her conduct?
You have Neil and you have Todd who are just looking at it like a freight train that they can't get off the tracks for. They had objected in advance, but that freight train was coming.
We want the bed of Susan and Jeffrey Wright admitted into evidence because we want to take that bed and show the jury exactly what that bed was that night in their house. It was a murder weapon, just like the knife.
The bed was assembled and it was showtime.
All rise, jury, please.
Kelly absolutely is known for the great level of empathy that she has for the victims of any violent crime. She had many meetings with Jeff Wright's family. She wasn't going to let them be surprised by how upsetting the evidence was about to become for them.
When you're a prosecutor, your job is to seek justice. Jeffrey Wright's family was a typical good family. What happened to them was horrible. Detective Reynolds, are these the pieces recovered from the scene on Berry Tree Road?
Yes, ma'am, now.
If I stand next to the defendant and we're both barefooted, do we appear to be the same height?
Very close.
Okay, thank you. Is Paul Doyle the same size and approximate height as Jeffrey Wright, 6'2", 220?
Yes, ma'am.
Paul Doyle is another prosecutor that I had luckily convinced Kelly had a much more similar stature and build to Jeff Wright than I did. I was definitely not going to be the guy that demonstrated in the bed.
Think I could take a knife away from him?
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
The district attorney's office at that time, as it was still fairly old-fashioned, and there was a rule in the employee handbook that any female prosecutor in trial had to wear a skirt or a dress.
So on that day, I had to get permission to wear a pantsuit, not a skirt. And I don't think I even told them because I need to straddle somebody. How about if you stand in that corner right there, right by Mr. Davis? The risk I was taking with the jury, trying to show them exactly how this went down, they could have thought I was being too theatrical. I didn't want to even have one juror kind of do this. Because it only takes one juror that you upset and you're toast. But I also hoped that by the time I argued to them, they would understand why I did it, and they would deliver the verdict that I thought was justice. Show the jury the way the left wrist was tied.
Kelly made sure that Mark Reynolds did a really good job of duplicating and setting up the scene to make it as close to the night of the murder.
I had examined the ligatures at the autopsy when they were cleaned up, and then later after they were removed.
What Susan did that night, she started out flirting, she stripped down, he stripped down or she helped him. She talked him and teased him into letting her tie up probably his feet first and then his hands. This wasn't the first time they did this. They'd done it before. And what tells me that is the candle wax. It was felt by his groin, by his penis, because she was teasing him with that too to set the scene. So if the defendant were to get up on top of Jeffrey Wright, something like this, and straddle him, and she's right-handed, and I attack at the head area first, which side of his face or most of the injury is going to be on?
On the left side.
During the bed demonstration, Susan is cognizant of the fact that people are watching her. So she is trying to act like this bed horrifies her.
It felt like she was making some mistakes with when she would cry and how she would cry. She wasn't coached very well, in my opinion. Where were most of the wounds concentrated on the body of Jeffrey Wright?
In the chest, the neck, and the chest.
Did you see anything consistent with a stab to the penis?
Not to the penis itself, no.
Because you saw what?
It was nicked. It was a superficial cut. It's more of a slicing.
Superficial slicings like this.
Right.
It was all Kelly. She became Susan Wright, and she got her message across very loud and very clear on how horrible the final moments of Jeff Wright actually were.
We're never going to have the time to go through 193 stab wounds. To me, in addition to the number, was the fact that there was some overkill, nicks and pricks. Susan stuck him in the eye and stuck him in the penis. How is that self-defense?
If he's like this, tied up, and she's on top of him, somehow she can stab him towards the center of his back or below that blade.
I think you'll be surprised at his mobility once you put that knife in his chest.
Neil Davis wanted to make a big deal out of the very few stab wounds that were toward the back of Jeffrey's body, and Mark Reynolds answered him and said, if you're twisting and turning and trying with all your might to get away from being tied up, she's going to slip a little, the knife is going to get bloody a little, it's not going to be a perfectly, completely all in the front fight.
What Kelly did, recreating her take on what happened, was genius. It was courtroom theater.
Everyone was riveted. We had not seen that level of drama and demonstration in a courtroom ever.
There are people out there to this day that think it was too much, it was too dramatic. I've heard the criticism, but I'll stick with what I believe. After putting on all those witnesses and doing the demonstration and it turning out as well as I hoped it would, we rested our case. And then it was time for us to hear once and for all what the defense was really going to say happened.
Your Honor, the defense would call Susan Wright.
If there was any moment that was going to outshine the bed demonstration, it was going to be Susan Wright's testimony.
When they called Susan Wright to the stand, my first thought was, great, because we have no idea what they're going to say. She's never been interviewed.
What type of things would set Jeff off?
If the light bills were more than what he thought they should be, if the house wasn't perfect, if dinner was bad.
Susan spends the entire first part of her testimony describing her relationship with Jeff.
He continually punched me in the chest and in the stomach until he wasn't angry anymore. He told me that he had a past problem with drugs, but that he had been in recovery for quite a while.
The defense spent a good amount of time building up how bad Jeffrey was, that he was a jerk, that he was mean, that he was insulting, and they should have. That was a smart strategy to try to use.
Jeff came home the 13th, Monday evening, and what did he want to do?
He had just gotten done with a boxing lesson, and he wanted to box with Bradley. Jeff got his hands up and started making jabs at Bradley's head.
What did Jeff's eyes look like?
Red and glassy. He was very agitated, very excitable.
The fact that the autopsy showed that Jeff had cocaine in his system adds, at least incrementally, credence to Susan's story, because people who are high on cocaine sometimes not only act out, but appear to have strength beyond their normal parameters.
I walked up to him and I told him that I thought that he needed help with his anger and with drugs. He threw me to the ground. My head hit the ottoman and he was kicking me. And he said, "Die, bitch," and I opened up my eyes.
Did you see the same butcher knife you'd seen?
I saw it in his hand and it was by his head and it was shining off the light. And I got it from him. I got it and it was in my right hand. And I pushed him as hard as I could. I pushed him off of me.
To say that Jeffrey and Susan struggled over a knife makes no sense. Jeffrey outweighed Susan by exactly 100 pounds, and he was almost a foot taller than her.
I was afraid that if I left the room, that Jeff was going to get up, and he was going to come after me. And then I tied up his right arm to the bed so that he couldn't get up.
She's trying to make the jury believe that she somehow is able to overpower him and get the knife, and she ties up his hands.
I started stabbing him again, and I couldn't stop because I was so scared.
And the reason she is stabbing him because she is broken with reality.
You dragged him off the bed?
Yes, I did.
Did he hit anything?
He hit the nightstand, and the candle went flying, and it fell on Jeff.
So she said that the candle wax got knocked over when she went to put him on the dolly to take him outside to the hole. But come on, think about where the end table is. How in the hell is it going to get on his groin? Because she was teasing him with that to set the mood, to set the scene. Now, at what point in the middle of him being tightly tied up, it turned into rage and violence and murder? I don't know.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. The Siegler, please.
When that gate opens and Kelly has to make a decision, should I act like I'm sympathetic to what she has gone through, or should I be dismissive of it and blow it out of the water?
I started that cross-examination with the plan to be very calm and even-keeled and not get bitchy. But it was easy to get annoyed with her because she was lying. By Saturday, you had gone to the doctor, gone to the cops, tried bleach, tried paint, tried getting rid of the carpet.
That was cleaning. I thought it was dirt and I had to make the house clean because Jeff was going to be mad.
That's right. In all the years of your marriage to Jeff, you always cleaned up the dirt and paint, didn't you?
No, but the house was dirty and I had to make the house perfect.
She decided to go hard at Susan, and there was certainly a risk in that.
When you stabbed him the 89th time or the 158th time, was your arm getting tired?
I was in such a state of shock and panic and sheer terror and fear that none of that ever occurred to me.
I remember when I was handling this case, my husband and I would talk about certain things, and in this case, the brutalness of 193 stab wounds. My daughter, who was about 10, she's the one who told me, "Mommy, didn't she get tired?" I thought, of course she had to have gotten tired. That's a picture of his penis. Unlike what you see on TV, in Texas, you're required to sit at counsel table as you question a witness. The only reason you get to let you approach a defendant or a witness is to point out something with evidence. And I approached Susan Wright because I had a picture. It was the one of the stab wounds close to Jeffrey's groin area, and I wanted to show her that. But she did that extra little, like, she was so, oh my God, overwhelmed with that picture. And that just pissed me off. Don't be acting so offended about what you did. You didn't stab his penis. That's not a stab like this, like you're mad, like you're afraid, like you can't stop.
Objection, Your Honor. I'm going to ask the prosecutor to get back down in the seat, please, and refrain from doing this 2 feet from the witness.
I did not sit there and slice at him. I did not do that.
Yes, you did. Didn't
No,
you?
I did not. No.
I'm done judging. Immediately after the cross-examination, we took a break, and a couple of people said, "Damn, girl, you went kind of hard at her." And I thought, ooh, I don't know if I want to hear that. So I wasn't 100% sure what the jury thought.
You have to determine if Susan Wright was in imminent fear and whether she acted in self-defense.
Because she looks like that, she thinks she can get away with fooling all 12 of you. She turned that bedroom into a torture chamber. She turned that bed into a butcher block. She is guilty of murder.
After a week and a half of testimony, the jury took 5 hours to come up with a verdict.
Stand. We, the jury, find the defendant, Susan Lucille Wright, guilty of murder as charged in the indictment.
Obviously, I was happy with the answer. But once the jury found Susan Wright guilty of murder, the biggest, most important, most difficult part of the trial was still to come: her punishment.
In Texas, we have a very unique system. Texas lets juries and not judges assess punishment in non-death penalty cases.
The worries that I had going into the punishment phase were that they were going to buy into the marriage being a bad one and they were going to cut her slack.
There is a real world where Susan Wright can get as little as 5 years probation for murder.
The whole game in this trial was making the jury understand she does not deserve probation or the minimum range of punishment or anywhere close to that for what she did to Jeffrey Wright.
We certainly had the very sympathetic testimony of Jeff's family.
Stab him in the eyeballs, but he's awake. I can't believe she did. She's evil.
Those were certainly emotional pulls for the jury to consider. Ultimately, the jury comes back pretty quickly.
Jeffrey's family asked why it wasn't life without parole, but they're never going to be happy with the answer. How could they be? Their family had been broken forever. And the kids, they went to live with Jeffrey's brother and his wife to let them grow up without her being anywhere around them to further ruin their lives. The judge found that her trial lawyers in our trial didn't put on enough of a defense about battered wife. I remember thinking they didn't do it the way I thought they would do it. I can't argue with that. Does she deserve a whole new punishment hearing because of that strategic choice that they all made? I didn't think she did.
I was able to get Susan a new punishment hearing and shave ultimately 5 years off of her original 25-year sentence.
So what? The second jury pretty much saw it the exact same way. They all had to go through all that misery and pain all over again. So in the end, what was the point?
Susan Wright, the woman dubbed the Blue-Eyed Butcher. Guess what, folks? She's out of prison.
Released this morning at 9:30 from this facility, this women's facility right behind me.
In December of 2020, when Susan Wright was released from prison, the media went crazy. They were blowing up my phone. It was all over the news. They were hounding her. It was a really big story.
Please don't do this to my family. Please stop. Have a heart, please.
If the courtroom is a theater of law, then this trial had its share of theater. Some would say more than its share. I say just enough. People don't want me to talk about what she was doing on top of that bed, on top of his body, because that's inflammatory and that's over the top and that's grandstanding. Give me a break. It was the right thing to do, because I guarantee you there is not one single person that was in that courtroom that walked away not knowing exactly what Susan Wright did that night she decided to murder Jeffrey. Susan Wright served her sentence. Her children and Jeffrey's family are still paying their sentence. They're still suffering because Jeffrey's gone forever. That's never going to change. We don't use the word closure. What the hell is closure? Closure means gaining peace. That's a bunch of bullshit. All we can try to get in the real world is justice.
This is the address where my life changed in 1979. It looks just like it did then.
This house here in the 10,100 block of Briar Rose is the scene of what homicide detectives say is a triple murder. The family shot to death.
No forced entry. It just didn't appear there was any struggle inside the house. We don't have a weapon in the house at this time.
This case is legendary in the Houston Police Department because of the complicated web of suspects and because of the bureaucratic interference. It took dedicated investigative work to solve.
That's the picture that haunted me. Just a reminder every day while I was working on that case.
Because of this case, Johnny gained the moniker the cop who wouldn't quit, rightfully so.
Just every time I turned around, I was told, you can't do this, quit kicking a dead horse. But I knew that it's going to come together.
As I walked in, my mind was completely blank. I was just there to do a job.
Even though this case was a victory for Johnny Bonds, this case broke him. And it's still hard for him to talk about it to this day.
I won't let anything stop me. It's about justice and it's about truth.
On the morning of July the 6th, 1979, a housekeeper that worked at the Wanstroth home went to work, knocked on the front door trying to get in. Nobody answered, so she went to the window and peered in and saw John and Diana slumped over in their living room. And when help arrived, they went inside the house and found that John and Diana had been shot in the head. They called the Houston Police Department, and Sergeant Johnny Bonds responds to the scene.
We walked in, and I immediately see Diana Wanstroth laying on the floor in front of the fireplace. John Wanstroth is sitting about 10 feet away from her. They had not started decomposing. Wasn't any odor, so we knew they'd been dead about 12 hours when they were discovered. Then I went into the nursery. I can't believe I still get so emotional. There was a crib there, and a 14-month-old baby's laying face down on a mattress, surrounded by stuffed animals in a pool of blood, and been shot in the back of the head. Except for the blood, you'd think this was just a baby sleeping. It's hard. Still hard. It's one of those things that I wished I couldn't see. Didn't appear the house had been burglarized or forced entry. I was thinking that probably the husband killed his wife and baby and then killed himself. He was a big man, and he filled up the chair. I thought, well, the gun's going to be beside him in the chair, or it's going to be on the floor under the chair. When we moved the body, there's no gun there. We searched the house thoroughly. Not only was there no gun, there was nothing to indicate they ever owned a gun. So there wasn't any doubt in my mind that this was not suicide, that it was a murder.
John Wanstrath is a scientist. He's an oceanographer. He developed a computer model to predict the storm surges of hurricanes. It was revolutionary at the time. Diana Wanstrath was almost the exact opposite of John Wanstrath. She was exuberant. She was a socialite, and the trappings of being a socialite mattered to her, where John, he couldn't care less.
Everybody was talking about what wonderful people they were. No marital problems, very happy. I learned all this while I'm out talking to friends and neighbors. All the neighbors adored him.
John, he was just a delightful, intelligent person, and Diana loved him very much. They had wanted a child, and when Diana realized that she couldn't have a child of her own, she accepted it, and she moved forward and adopted Kevin. It was wonderful. I mean, we were thrilled for her. She was very doting. They'd recently moved back to Houston. They were planning their 10th wedding anniversary. She had social connections. They didn't have any enemies.
You know, the first thing I look for is motive at that point. Who would want to kill them, and why kill the whole family? And one of the first thoughts that I had would be money and inheritance. So I started looking at who would benefit from the family's death, and of course it was other family members.
John and Diana's estate is worth about $1 million, and that's in 1979. Today, that would be over $4 million.
We've seen people killed for a whole lot less. The harder thing here to appreciate happening is that you would also want to kill your own blood and to kill a baby.
The day of the funeral, Johnny went to John Wanstrath's family and told them he wanted to polygraph everyone. They were a little shaken up.
Now, I did this intentionally for them to be together. I said, you all are going to get money out of these deaths. So I said, unfortunately, you're suspects until I can prove otherwise. They didn't protest. They all agreed to do so. So they came into homicide, and John Wanstrath's family passed the polygraph.
After Johnny was able to clear out by polygraphing all of John Wanstrath's family, he brought in Diana's only surviving family member.
Diana Wanstrath had a brother that lived in Houston named Markham Duff Smith. Markham comes in with Cindy, his wife. This guy looks like he just walked out of a GQ magazine. He's got on a suit, a tie, perfect hair.
Markham Duff Smith says he was home all night with his wife Cindy, and she confirms that.
And I said, I'd still like for you to take polygraphs so I can eliminate you and work on whoever actually did this. But now Markham's almost indignant. You know, how long is this going to take? My lawyer told me I shouldn't take this test. You know, and his attitude was just wrong. And Markham, his graph was all over the place. The heart rate, respiration, and perspiration. He failed the polygraph test. At this point, my number one suspect for the murder of the Wonstroth family is Markham Duff Smith.
But polygraphs are not admissible in court, and Markham Duff Smith has an alibi backed up by his wife. And then this case took another crazy turn when the medical examiner released his findings. Dr. Joseph Yahimchek is the most respected medical examiner in the whole state, and this is his case. The autopsy results came in 7 months later because for the first time ever, Dr. Yahimchek wanted to do this psychological autopsy with this new expert that he brought in from the outside.
Dr. Thomas Whaley, he's also a Catholic priest. He's a psychologist there to work on psychological autopsies. And at that point, this was the first psychological autopsy that had been done in Harris County. It was a political thing. New York and LA both had staff psychologists that did psychological autopsies, and Yahimchek wanted to have the same capability that New York and LA had.
I never heard of this. It was a new thing going around in, I guess, medical examiner circles back then. I'm not familiar with it. I never heard of it.
Diana had recently been treated for depression. Dr. Whaley believed suicide could possibly run in the family. Diana's mother, Gertrude Zabolio, died from suicide 4 years earlier. So it was understandable if Diana did too.
And they wanted to know all about the conversation I had with Diana the day she died to see what was going through her mind. And I told them Diana would never hurt Kevin or John. She couldn't have been planning this party and so happy and tending to Kevin. And she just wasn't capable of it.
But as Thomas Whaley is doing the psychological autopsy on Diana, he finds a Playboy magazine in the house, and he finds a vibrator. He told me that Diana was probably a lesbian and that she killed everybody because she was afraid this was going to come out. And I told him, I said, you're just making this crap up and saying this might be suicide. And I'm like, well, there's no gun. And Whaley says, well, now you don't rule that out. Somebody could have taken the gun. Maybe you hadn't found it yet. Maybe it's hidden somewhere. And I'm like, how did you kill yourself and then hide the gun? It's like you're creating something that doesn't exist to fit your scenario, and it's ridiculous. When you get a case that's real suicide by the medical examiner's office, we're done. That's a solved case.
Front page, murder, suicide. The medical examiner had made his ruling. And it was just like the day I had the call that they'd been murdered. I wanted Diana's name cleared of this horrible thing.
When the newspaper came out, I was working on the city desk, and I get a call that morning. The anonymous caller said that they didn't know about the Wonstroth murders, but Diana's mother's death 4 years earlier was not a suicide.
Diana Wonstroth inherited like $100,000 from her mother's death. So did Markham.
We agreed we would make a deal with Walt Waltheiser about everything.
It's sort of like making a deal with the devil.
Even though the deaths of the Wonstroth family were ruled a murder-suicide, Johnny Bonds continued to work the case. In the meantime, a call comes in anonymously to the local newspaper saying that there's more going on to the death of Gertrude Zabolio.
The anonymous caller said that Diana's mother's death 4 years earlier was not a suicide. Mrs. Zabolio was murdered by a coin collector. I went to the police, and that's where I met Johnny Bonds.
Diana Wonstroth inherited like $100,000 from her mother, Trudy Zabolio's death. So did her brother Markham. After further investigation, found out that John and Diana had done a will about 6 months before they were killed. In the case of simultaneous death, they left everything to their adopted son, Kevin, and named Markham and Cindy Duff Smith as the guardians of the child. And if Kevin had been killed, Markham was going to inherit a lot of money from this.
So now Johnny Bonds hears this tip and starts to wonder if Diana's brother, Markham Duff Smith, wiped out his whole family.
Detectives that worked on the case entitled to their opinion with any case. I've never known one yet that there wasn't unanswered questions. Adams?
I was getting pressure from the homicide captain, more or less saying back off. I was told, we got to work with Dr. Joe, don't make him mad. He was a powerful man. He made more than the governor or the football coach at University of Texas. But I felt like I owed it to Diana to prove that she was not a killer.
If you know Johnny Bonds like I do, you know that he doesn't back off from anything. So Johnny takes his information and starts looking even harder into Diana's brother, Markham Duff Smith.
At this point, Duff Smith is the suspect. So I was going around talking to everybody I could find out that knew him. And that's how I found out about Walt Waldhauser. They were the closest of friends. The guy was a licensed gun dealer. He had a pilot's license. And he was a real estate investor and a coin collector.
Could Walt Waldhauser have been the coin collector that the anonymous tipster talked about when they called in to say that Gertrude Zabolio's case wasn't a suicide? Johnny sure thought looking down that road might help him figure out what happened to who murdered John and Kevin and Diana.
It wasn't much later that I was transferred from homicide to internal affairs. Against my wishes. I think I was transferred to get me out of homicides.
It's really crazy and really sad how often egos can affect a case. Dr. Joe was a very powerful man in Harris County, and he did not like being questioned, and Johnny Bonds was doing that very loudly.
If I wasn't in homicide, I shouldn't have been working on that case at all. Luckily, I had some supervisors that knew me. They didn't mind if I did keep working on it.
During that period of time we worked together, in internal affairs, I knew that he was continuing to investigate the Wanstroth murders. I was asked by Johnny to help him on the case. I think all of us, to some extent, were obsessed because of the depravity of it. The idea that you would go in and kill a little baby sleeping in his crib and kill his parents, that's a pretty strong motivating factor for you to keep working on something.
That's the picture that haunted me. That's the one that looked so much like my son. I had pictures of Kevin, and I had a picture of my son. They looked like twins, and I put them on the wall, side by side, in my office. Just a reminder every day of why I was working on that case. I kept up with Walt Waldhauser and Markham Duff Smith. I knew where everybody lived. I knew what they were doing. I was actually going by their houses and watching them. There were days I'd find reasons not to go home. My wife wanted me to quit. We were fighting a lot. I had my wife tell me, is this dead family more important than the family you have here? And that's a hard question to answer, because I felt like, I'm doing something important and you ought to understand that. We ended up splitting up. That was it.
In the summer of 1980, 1 year after the Wanstroth murders, it's discovered that Markham Duff Smith had left his wife and moved into this mansion along with Walt Waldhauser, who had also left his wife.
So I wanted to meet with Waldhauser's wife, Debbie Waldhauser. And at this point, Walter and Debbie were getting a divorce. So I basically just approached her. I said, look, I've been working on this case. And Debbie says, I'll tell you everything I know on one condition. You got to help me get my child back. We're having a child custody hearing in civil court Friday afternoon. And I decided to show up. I'm outside the courtroom. Here comes Waldhauser with Duff Smith, his attorney. And Waldhauser sees me over and he walks up to Johnny, like we're old friends. What are you doing here? I said, I'm going to say you're a suspect in killing the Wanstroths and Trudy Zabolio. He says, you can't say that. And I said, that's what I'm going to say. The attorney gets the little boy's hand, walks over and hands him off to Debbie Waldhauser. They get in the elevator and leave. So she got her kid back. And I said, it's your turn. She told me about him taking all the stuff out of the house. It was a pile of garbage. I said, well, let's go out there. I want to look at and see what he left. I started digging around in it, and I found 2 or 3 letters from a guy named Alan Janeka to Walt Waldhauser.
Alan Janeka is a rougher character, has been to the pen before.
The letters were very vague, but they're talking about when I get out, we're going to do this deal. And they were talking about doing crimes, but not specific.
So Johnny had started to believe that Markham Duff Smith and Walt Waldhauser had hired Alan Janeka to kill Gertrude Zavolio, and then ultimately to kill the Wonstroth family.
I was working in internal affairs, and I went and talked to the captain. I said, this is fixing to come together. It's still going to be a problem because of the medical examiner, and he's not going to like this. So the captain of internal affairs ended up going to the chief of police, and they basically said, you work on this case, and don't you worry about anybody else. You're covered.
We were looking through police records and saw where a detective in homicide pulled Alan Janeka's rap sheet in the investigation of the death of a drug dealer.
Johnny and Dan find out that in 1979, Alan Janeka and this guy named Richard Bufkin killed a small-time drug dealer over a marijuana deal that went bad. And Richard Bufkin went to jail for it. Janeka got away.
Sometimes situations come along that investigators want to take advantage of. In this case, Bufkin had been sentenced on a crime that Janeka skated on. So Johnny's hope was that Bufkin would be mad enough with Janeka that he'll give him some new information on him.
Richard Bufkin, he has paroled out. We traced him down through his family. He calls us, and Bonds is able to interview him.
Hello? I don't really have the privacy to talk right now.
All right, can you get on another line?
Hold on just a second, please.
Okay.
Can I call you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You call me collect.
Richard Bufkin said, Janeka abandoned me. He took off and left the country, and I got left holding the bag. Said, I got arrested, and he never even got picked up. Then I got through asking him about that, and I said, let me ask you something else. I said, did he ever say anything about wanting to kill a family?
You mean that actually did happen? That actually did happen.
Johnny believed with all of his heart this was not a murder-suicide, and he wasn't going to let anybody get away with it. So Johnny tracked down Richard Bufkin, just doing a long shot, hoping he was mad at Janeka and would say something.
Bufkin confesses that he'd been approached to do the murders of the Wonstroth family. He says, Janeka, he asked me if I'd help him kill this family, that he had a friend that wanted his sister and her husband and their baby killed.
He told me, I would waste the man and the woman, and he would waste the baby. What he described to you, Richard, did actually take place. Mister, I was in jail. I know you were in jail. You mean that actually did happen? That actually did happen. They killed a man, a woman, and a 14-month-old baby. The baby's asleep in the crib, and they shot it in the back of the head. Yeah, that's just how he told me he was going to do it, too.
When he told me that, I cried. I just sat there and bawled. That's the day everything fell in place. That's the day I found out who my killer was.
Now that Johnny Bonds and Dan McAnulty have more information on Janeka and what he was capable of, it's time for them to track him down and start asking him some hard questions.
We get information that Alan Janeka's in the Atlanta area, so I fly out and arrange to meet with the local police to locate him. The local police have identified his girlfriend, Karen Holder. They've been surveilling her and her sister. They work at a supper club in the area, so I go into the club with one of the local officers in plain clothes. We do see the girls talking to some guys at a table. The deputy that I'm with recognizes this man as a former law enforcement officer. So I go talk to him. He told me that Karen had told him that she has a pistol that this guy killed some people with in Houston.
There was one bullet recovered at the crime scene. It was a hollow point .22 Magnum round. When the firearms people examined the bullet, it came back 100% to one gun, which had never happened in my whole life. This was 100% Colt Frontier Scout .22 Magnum, like what you would see in an old Western. Very seldom you see a gun like that used in a murder.
The next morning, we got to Karen Holder's apartment and knocked on the door. Karen was there with her sister. I then confronted her. I said, I've talked to someone who told me that you have the gun that Alan Janeka killed some people in Houston with. She gets up, walks to the bedroom, comes back with this pistol in her hand.
Dan McAnulty called me and said, sit down. You're not going to believe this. He had the actual murder weapon in his hand. Firearms expert was testing the gun and saying that is the gun that fired the round that killed Kevin.
Karen Holder told us where Alan Janeka was staying in Houston. But our plan was to first have Karen call Alan Janeka, let me record it. I brought an old cassette recorder with me. She speaks to him for almost an hour on the phone, getting him to make certain admissions, telling him she's nervous about the gun being in the house. I'm going to go throw it in the river. And he's saying, no, Karen, don't do that. I'll come there. Let me get rid of it. And don't say anything to anybody. And you need to quit talking like this over the phone. Once she finishes talking to him, I called Bonds, tell them to go in and get him arrested now.
The Sunday before Thanksgiving in 1980, we actually got SWAT out that night to arrest him. He was arrested without incident.
He subsequently made a sworn written statement at the police station later that night wherein he denied being involved. So I'm going to take him back up to the jail up on the 5th floor. So on the way up, he says, look, I want to talk to you. I'm not going to go down by myself on this. He waives his right to a lawyer, agrees to talk to me, and then proceeds to confess to killing the Wonstroth family.
We had a confession, we had the murder weapon. It happened so quick. I don't know how to describe it. It's like having a terrible pain and all of a sudden it's gone.
But he agreed to tell me in great detail how the planning occurred with Walt Waldhauser, how they secured a gun, and that was the gun that he used.
Waldhauser was paying Janeka through a Western Union telegram. We found the original receipt he signed and filled out. Waldhauser's prints were on that receipt. We already had Janeka in jail, and then we arrested Waldhauser.
At the time that Walt Waldhauser was arrested, we had a very strong case on Alan Janeka. But dangling out there was Markham Duff Smith, who was the mastermind behind everything. We didn't have enough evidence on him to convict him. We agreed we would make a deal with Walt Waldhauser to get him to testify against Markham Duff Smith about everything. Nobody liked it because Walt Waldhauser was as bad as any person I have ever come across, ever. As far as his moral capability, right and wrong, nothing fazed him. But we didn't have any other choice to go after Duff Smith.
It was sort of like making a deal with the devil. That's how we felt.
Waldhauser agrees if we reduce the capital murders to murders, he gets 30 years and immunity on anything else he tells us. He'll testify that Markham Duff Smith hired him and Janeka to kill the Wonstroths.
Walt Waldhauser and Alan Janeka are only involved in this crime because they did it for Markham Duff Smith. That's who hired him. That's who the mastermind is. That's who's the most culpable of all these defendants. Sometimes, based on the state of your evidence, and in this particular case, you have to cut a deal. Because if you don't cut a deal, then you're running the risk that the most egregious defendant walks, or maybe even everybody walks. Having to tell a family that you're cutting a deal is awful. You're telling them that one of the people involved in murdering their loved ones is going to get a sweet deal in order to get justice for anybody. It's a hard pill to have to swallow.
Waldhauser tells us Duff Smith had approached Diana and John. He wanted to build a new house in their neighborhood, and they were going to loan him money to get the house built. And Duff Smith says, well, I've got a contractor that wants to meet with y'all. And that contractor was Janeka. Janeka tells Waldhauser, I can't do this by myself. So Waldhauser goes with him to the house. They're sitting on a couch facing John and Diana. Janeka gets up, pulls the gun out. John's sitting in a chair. He comes up behind him, shoots him in the top of the head twice.
From there, my co-defendant sprayed Mrs. Wonstroth in the face with the mace and grabbed a hold of her and threw her down, which then at that time I walked over and put the gun to the side of her head and shot her. And at that time he told me, get the kid who's in the bedroom. As I walked in, opened the door and walked in, it was dark. I could only see from the hall light of the baby laying in the crib. At this time, my mind was completely blank. That I was just there to do a job. And looking at the little fella in the crib, I raised the weapon and pulled the trigger.
Walthauser instructed Alan all of them had to die because it was an inheritance that was being sought, and they couldn't leave an heir.
The next day, they bring Walthauser from the jail to a courtroom. He and his attorney shows up. I've got a typewriter, and I start typing his confession. Right off the bat, Walthauser looked at me and says he has information on another murder. We start talking to Walt Walthauser, and he tells us about murder of Trudy Zabolio by Alan Janeka and a guy named Paul McDonald. Paul McDonald was a friend of Walthauser's. Paul told us about the phone call that he gets in 75 that Walthauser has a friend that wants his mother killed. And do you know anybody to do it? So he just looks, hey, Alan, the guy wants somebody killed. You know somebody to do it? He said, yeah, I'll do it.
Paul McDonald drives the car. They go over to the Bolio house. Alan Janeka goes in, and he's in there an hour or so. He had her write some notes like she was committing suicide, and he placed him around there in her room, and then he strangled her to death. Homicide detectives show up. Medical examiner rules, well, she committed suicide. She choked herself to death.
Back then, forensics was not nearly as good and evolved as what we have today.
Alan Janeka, he tells me that Markham says, I want proof that they killed his mother. So Janeka had got Trudy Zabolio's driver's license out of her purse. They meet Dust Smith at a coffee shop, and Paul McDonald hands Markham Dust Smith his mother's driver's license.
Even though Walt Walthauser found the hitman, because of his deal to give information against Markham Dust Smith, he is not charged with the murder of Gertrude Zabolio. Paul McDonald got 16 years.
Janeka denies strangling Gertrude Zabolio, and even though Johnny and Dan felt like Alan Janeka was instrumental in Gertrude Zabolio's murder, they just could never prove it. In December of 1980, Alan Janeka was charged with the murder of Kevin Wanstroth because not only did they have evidence from Janeka admitting he committed that murder, they also had the bullet recovered that matched Janeka's gun. Well, they could have charged him with any of the three murders, but they chose the one of the baby because look how emotional that would be to a jury.
After Walter Walthauser confessed he was involved in the death of Gertrude Zabolio and the Wanstrath killings and implicated Markham Dust Smith, the big day had finally arrived, and Johnny and Dan went out to Markham Dust Smith's house.
His girlfriend answered the door. Markham was just getting out of the shower.
He looks at me at the mirror. He doesn't flinch. He just looks up and he's shaving. I said, Markham, I got a warrant for your arrest. Handcuffed him, took him out. Dan had his personal camera with him, and we're walking out to the car, and Dan says, wait, and he walks in front of us, and I'm standing there holding him like this, and Dan takes a picture. Both sitting there real solemn looking, and I'm kind of biting my tongue, trying not to smile, and I didn't. We actually ended up arresting Dust Smith for Trudy Zabolio's murder. He wasn't charged for the Wanstrath case. He was tried for killing his mother.
Well, they could have charged him with any of the murders, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to pick your best case and try that one, because what happens if the defendant's found not guilty, if there's a hung jury, if the punishment is way less than what you expect, if any of those bad outcomes happen, you still have other cases you can file on a defendant and try him for.
I remember Johnny called, and he said that Markham was arrested. Oh, it was poetic justice. It was relief of a sort. I just remember being so ecstatic that we were getting where we were getting.
Finally, once all the confessions are in hand, the murder weapons obtained, reluctantly, the medical examiner's office changed the ruling of the Wanstrath's death to triple homicide.
Yesterday, Janeka's former girlfriend, Karen Holder, told the court he gave her the pistol, saying he'd used it to kill 3 people. But so far, Judge Jimmy James has not allowed her testimony to be heard by the jury.
The defense in this case claimed Karen was common law married to Alan Janeka. We were pretty surprised about that. The judge said, they're married. You can't use anything she said at the time of the offense or since the time of the offense about Alan Janeka. All of her testimony and statements are inadmissible.
In some of the southern states, because it's about the sanctity of marriage, the marriage is more important than getting away with murder, believe it or not. And what it means is that you can't testify against your spouse on any communications you have during the time you're married. Very much a problem and a complication.
So now we have the gun, but the difficulty was to prove that Alan Janeka had it and gave it to Karen.
Judge Jimmy James ruled that Alan Janeka's girlfriend couldn't testify about the gun due to the marital communications privilege. The prosecution needed to figure out a workaround to make that gun evidence admissible.
And that was proved through Karen's sister, who was there in the apartment, who lived in the apartment, and other witnesses could tie Alan Janeka to bringing the gun to the apartment. The jury finds Alan Janeka guilty of capital murder, of murdering Kevin Wanstroth for money, which made it a capital offense. He got the death penalty. And then we started the trial with Markham Duff Smith for killing his mother. We did everything we could to keep Walt Walthauser from ever being around Markham Duff Smith in the county jail. So they never had contact with each other. And then one time, the sheriff's department made a mistake. Walt Walthauser and Markham Duff Smith were in the same holding cell together alone. They were working a deal, how they both could go free.
As it turns out, once a con man, always a con man.
Walter Walthauser starts talking to another inmate to sabotage his confession against his pal Markham Duff Smith.
Walter would start telling people in the county jail, oh, I'm making this all up. I'm doing this to frame Markham Duff Smith, because he had already gotten his 30 years on 3 cases. And we looked at the agreement. Never in there did it say, if you change your testimony, the deal is off. We had to go through with the deal because we didn't draw it up good enough to keep that possibility from happening.
The prosecution decided that because Walt Walthauser was making stuff up in the back, he's a liar. So how credible can he be to a jury? So they ended up not even calling him.
Oh, I was pissed. I was so mad.
We went to trial thinking we may not even convict Markham Duff Smith because the evidence was so flimsy. But then there was a once-in-a-lifetime courtroom moment. We get a call from the warden. You got a guy up here that wants to talk to you. Jerry Saul Eichenhorst. He was serving time in the Texas penitentiary. He was serving 2 life sentences, one for armed robbery, one for rape, and I prosecuted him on the rape case.
He says, Duff Smith approached me and said if I'd lie, that he'd help pay for my appeal, and that when I got out of jail, he'd give me some money if I'd lie for him. Then he gave me this to testify. He pulls out this script, 2 full pages of a script for him to testify to. So we brought it back. We got Duff Smith's fingerprints on this, and Eichenhorst too. We had a handwriting expert look at it, and I had the notebook that we could say was his writing. I said, yeah, that's the same guy who wrote this, you know. There was a discovery period. If we'd have had this information 2 weeks before the trial, we would have had to give it to the defense. Then we would have called him, but it would have been better if they called him, and that's exactly what they did.
So during the defense, they start calling these inmates in the county jail who got on the witness stand and said, Walt Walthauser told me that he was framing Duff Smith and that he was not telling the truth and he did it all, etc. They all were saying the same thing. Then they call Eichenhorst. He takes the witness stand. The defense says Walt Walthauser did the killings and framed Duff Smith. And is that true? That is not a true statement. Well, how do we know you're telling the truth now? Well, I've got evidence. Out comes this piece of paper where Markham Duff Smith had written out what you're supposed to say. Talk about a moment in time. There was a gasp in the courtroom. The jury, the spectators, the lawyers, and Markham Duff Smith. And he turned completely white, then red, and it was shuddering, physically shuddering.
I looked over at Markham Duff Smith and I said, Markham, you just signed your death warrant.
The lawyers say to Eichenhorst, well, why would you do that? The prosecutors promise you something? Why would you do that? Aren't you a snitch? Eichenhorst says, yes, I'm a snitch. The worst thing in the penitentiary in Texas is to be a snitch, except to be a baby killer.
After deliberating for only 40 minutes, the jury in Gertrude Zabolio's murder, where the defendant was Markham Duff Smith, came back with a verdict.
The jury comes back and says guilty. I had feelings of jubilation.
The jury then goes and deliberates after the verdict of guilty on the issue of punishment. And they have to answer two questions: whether the conduct was deliberate and whether or not he would commit criminal acts of violence in the future.
They gave him death in, I think it was a record, like 12 minutes. It was the quickest death sentence I ever experienced.
Both of us felt this sense of relief. For a year and a half, we lived and breathed this case and spent a lot of time away from our families. It's a great feeling to find out the truth and have the right result to occur.
So you definitely feel that justice was done today? Yes, it was done.
When the verdict was rendered against Markham, I was actually happy. When I say that I was happy, it's not the happy of joy. I guess it's really more of a relief. This was just, this had to be done.
I was not surprised at all. The minute that script was read to the jury, it was over.
The day of Markham's execution, as he's on the gurney and they're putting the lethal injection in his arm, he confesses. Asked for forgiveness, he was a sinner, and yes, he'd killed his family and was internally sorry for it.
I guess it was a surprise that he actually confessed, but maybe his conscience had gotten to him. All along, all I wanted was for Diana, John, and Kevin, and Trudy now, to have their justice and to give us some peace and closure.
I witnessed Alan Janeka's execution in 2003. I didn't feel sorry for him, and I didn't feel any great relief. His execution was gentle compared to all the damage he'd done. Later, when it's all over with, I got all kinds of awards and accolades, and got a book written about the case, and I got this Meritorious Service Award, which is like the highest award the police department gets. Captain Adams, the one that told me to shut up, he nominated me for that award. And he asked me to come back to homicide. In the long run, it ended up being great for my career because I stuck with it. It ended up being the best thing ever happened in my life. Walthauser comes up every year for parole, and I show up protesting his parole. If anybody ever ought to die in prison, it's him. I've wept a lot over this case. That picture of Kevin Wanstroth, I'll never forget it. There was pressure to let up, to quit, but I couldn't live with myself to let that happen.
When you see Johnny and Dan and Ted Poe talk about this case and what it did to them, I bet you they would tell you that this case was the defining case of each of their careers. I think that these murders is just a reminder to all of us who do this job what the cases do to you. They take away a little bit of your soul. They take away a little bit of your humanity. Might make you stronger, might make you better in the courtroom, but it also makes you a different human being.
Tara, you gotta get up. Come on. I heard guns popping off.
On a quiet night in Houston, Texas, an all-American family is ripped apart when a former NFL player and his beautiful wife are brutally murdered inside their own home. As more and more details of this grisly murder came to light, this facade of the picture-perfect family starts to come apart, and the family starts to point fingers at each other. It was a complicated case. A number of prosecutors get involved, including two that I helped train, one now a defense lawyer, who battle it out against each other.
Test firing a weapon? You know what his intent is.
Whatever the story is, figure it out.
Neither of these lawyers is going to back down as they fight each other and they fight for justice and truth in the courtroom.
Houston 911, do you need medical, police, or fire?
I just heard 2 gunshots downstairs in my parents' room.
And your name?
AJ?
Any medical attention needed?
Yes. I heard gunshots, so I don't really know.
Did it sound like a handgun, rifle, or shotgun?
I'm not sure about gunshots. I know my dad has 3. You're destroyed. It's there.
And where are you at in the house? Okay. Okay, they're asking you to step out of the house.
As HPD arrives, AJ turns off the alarm system as he meets them at the front door with his little sister, Kara. At that point, the number one priority is to get AJ and his little sister outside of the house and to safety.
The initial patrol officers swept the house and discovered there was no sign of forced entry. As they were searching, officers did not find anyone else in the home. And then they enter the bedroom of A.J. Armstrong and Kara's parents. And they see Dawn and Antonio Sr., who had been shot.
As soon as I pull up, an officer proceeds to tell me we have 2 victims upstairs in bed with GSW to the head, which is a gunshot wound to the head. We enter the room. Closest to the door is Mrs. Armstrong. And I immediately go to her first. I just go to checking pulses and looking for a chest rise and fall. And then once I didn't feel anything for about 15-20 seconds, I realized that she's no longer with us. Immediately after that, I'm walking around the bed to Mr. Armstrong's side, and he had a pillow over his head. I take the pillow off, and he's still alive. He's still breathing, he's still trying to live, so we go into rescue mode. He has blood everywhere, and you can see the entry wound from his gunshot wound to the head. Once we get Antonio onto the stretcher, I have a young gentleman come up to me. He looks me in my eyes and he says, "Is he going to be okay?" And you could tell that he was worried. He didn't say who he was at the time. He looked like a family member, and I just told him, I was like, "We're doing the best we can for him."
While the police are searching the house, A.J. Armstrong calls his brother Josh, who lives right down the street, to tell him about what had just happened.
I had gotten woken up by Josh coming in, yelling. I was half asleep still, like, what is going on? He said that his younger brother, AJ, had called him and told him that someone was in his parents' house a couple streets away. Josh told me to stay at the apartment, and then he ran over there.
The homicide detectives secure the scene and they look around. And they see shell casings in the bedroom. They also noticed that there was a bullet hole in the ceiling right outside the parents' bedroom, which was under A.J. Armstrong's bedroom. They noticed as they sweep the kitchen that there is a gun on the countertop that could be the murder weapon.
When HPD examined the gun they believed to be the murder weapon, they didn't find any fingerprints, but they were able to determine that that's the same gun that belonged to Antonio Armstrong Sr., and he normally kept it in a bedside table.
Also on the counter, there is a scratched out note that says, "We've been watching you for a long time." It's like something out of a movie.
That only adds to the mystery, because who would want Don and Antonio Sr. dead?
It was hard to live in Houston, Texas, and not know about the Armstrongs. Antonio Sr., who is an All-American college football player who gets drafted in the NFL, he parlays that into owning gyms in Houston. His wife is beloved in the community, and they send their kids to the most prestigious school in Houston, the Kincaid School. They're the kind of folks you would want to be jealous of, but nobody could be because they were so darn charismatic.
Antonio and Don were the greatest people, really caring. Josh and his mother had a great bond. The family just seemed so happy, so close together.
After the attack, Antonio Sr. was on life support for several hours, and sadly, he passed that evening, but he had never woken up. He was never able to say what happened.
Josh was so confused. People were very sad. Antonio and Don were just all around great people.
The police interview AJ, his little sister Kara, and the older brother Josh, who arrives at the scene a little later. Based on that interview and the evidence they retrieved from the crime scene, the investigators are suspicious about what happened that night. So A.J. Armstrong is taken down to HPD and questioned into the early hours of the morning.
What's your first name?
Antonio.
So you're 16?
Yes, sir.
You know, we need to sit down and talk to you, figure what happened today, what's been going on.
It was like probably 1 or 2, and I went to the restroom, and when I came out, I heard the door open, and I thought it was my parents, so I walked downstairs when I heard the 2 gunshots go off, and I ran back upstairs. And when I ran back upstairs, I heard somebody run out of my parents' room and hit the door, and then I don't know how they got out.
Well, did you physically see somebody? Or?
No, I saw him running, so I just took off back upstairs and went straight to my closet, and that's when I called 911. I just personally felt bad because I saw the guy. I feel like I should have done something.
Okay, when you called 911, there's just so much that doesn't match.
In a 16-minute 911 tape, he never mentions that there is a masked man in the house. Then hours later, in his statement says, "Oh, there was a masked man in the house and I saw him running."
You know, ultimately, we need to figure out what happened today. When we start having inconsistencies, It starts making it tough. Because now we're at a loss of trust.
Josh recently had found out that he was not biological to Antonio Sr. Antonio was a stepdad. He felt like he was kind of the black sheep of the family.
Investigators noticed a burn mark at the top of the stairs. That was his first attempt to kill his parents.
While A.J. Armstrong Jr. is at HPD being questioned about the murder of his parents, A.J. makes the surprising admission that he saw the suspect leaving his parents' bedroom.
What did he look like?
I mean, they had it was like a mask. You could only see the eyes and the mouth, but he looked like a black guy, but I'm not 100% positive, but I'm pretty sure it was an African American.
In a 16-minute 911 tape, he never mentions that there is a masked man in the house. Then hours later, in his statement says, "Oh, there was a masked man in the house and I saw him running." That just doesn't add up.
Does your dad own a gun?
Yes, he does. He has his case in one of his drawers, And like my dad, his drawers, the closet, and under the bed is like off limits. So like, I've never gone in there or like seen it or anything like that.
You know, when we're in the study that leads to your dad's room.
Right.
In there, when you look up, there's a bullet hole in the ceiling that comes from your bedroom.
Bullet hole in the ceiling.
Yeah, that comes through the floor. And then on the floor, there's an actual bullet that was actually fired.
I can explain the gun from the room upstairs. It was like 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. Me and one of my friends was just like playing around. Hey, like, have you ever shot a gun before? And I like went and checked the 3 places, and the gun was under my dad's bed. I laid my pillow thinking like that would stop it, but I guess it did not stop it.
Yeah. Now, see, and that kind of goes back to what we were saying just a minute ago. Said that you haven't seen it, and then now we kind of give you a little more, and then it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is kind of the time to clear it up.
Deactivate the alarm before you unlock the door for the officers?
Yes.
And you see, and that's kind of where we're at, that dilemma where, you know, just several things that aren't lining up.
Right.
You know, you had to unlock the door to get out. The back door's locked. Everything's locked.
Right.
The house is completely secured with locks and with an alarm system. Your brother Josh isn't even there. He's down the street at his place.
Your sister's asleep.
So that only leaves you.
I had nothing to do with this.
HPD pays very close attention to the statement and the details of what A.J. Armstrong tells him that night. That, along with the 911 call that A.J. made that night, and all of the other things that HPD saw with their own eyes at the scene, A.J.'s story didn't add up. On top of that, the gun that was recovered at the crime scene that belonged to Antonio Sr. was tested, and they were able to identify that as being the gun that fired the bullets into Antonio and Dawn's bodies. Based on all that they learned, they arrested A.J. Armstrong, and he was subsequently indicted for capital murder.
The family was completely behind A.J. since day one. And Josh was very angry. He said they have the wrong person. He didn't do this.
I remember when this case happened because the school where AJ went is where my daughter Samantha went to school, and my daughter Kelsey went to school with Josh at St. Francis. So we all knew the kids, the boys, we all knew of the parents. Everybody knew somebody involved in this case, whether it was the defendant or one of the victims.
At Antonio and Dawn's funeral, I could really see how much so many people cared about them. People were very sad. It was really hard to see Josh like that. I've never seen anybody that sad and that hurt. I just remember he was crying for a long time, and I didn't really know what to do other than just be there for him.
I was brought in to represent AJ when Chris Collins, my co-counsel in this case, called me. Chris Collins was Antonio Sr.'s personal lawyer. When I spoke with AJ's family members about AJ and I learned about AJ, I was like, there's no way this kid could have committed this crime. It just doesn't make any sense.
Rick DeToto is now a very well-known defense attorney, but before that, he worked at the DA's office, and that's where I first met him. He was like this stud guy walking around real cocky, not intimidated by anyone. When I heard that A.J. Armstrong hired Rick DeToto as his lawyer, I thought, ooh, good move.
AJ's initially charged in juvenile court, and one of the things the prosecutors in juvenile court can do in Texas is determine if they want to certify someone as an adult. Prosecutor filed a petition to certify him. We had a hearing. The judge in the juvenile court certified him as an adult.
Because A.J. Armstrong was only 16 years old, he is able to be released on bond, and he's placed in the custody of his grandmother, Kay Winston. Before the trial, there's still evidence that can be gathered and collected to get the case even tighter and cleaner and stronger. In the weeks following the murder, HPD begins putting together its case, along with the prosecutors, which includes the evidence they retrieved from the crime scene, as well as the alarm records and cell phone data.
Text messages showed that the family relationship from the outside it's perceived as good, but it was volatile from within. Through the text messages, we learned that there were issues between AJ and his parents. There were events leading up to the night of the murders. He was using money on drugs. And more than anything, I think his mother was upset by the constant lying. It was a boiling pot from within inside the four walls of that house.
But it's actually A.J. Armstrong's actions the days before this murder that was one big piece of our puzzle to point to one direction of who killed the Armstrongs.
He fired a gun in his room through two pillows down to the second floor. Also, investigators noticed a burn mark at the top of the stairs. And it smells like gasoline on the carpet. AJ said he had just dropped a match. Well, when you look at it, clearly that is not what would happen if somebody just dropped a match. They found a bottle in his room. They tested it and it came back to having gasoline inside the bottle.
If you look at where that burn mark is, it's at the top of the staircase, right outside his parents' bedroom. And so if that lights up the house, the parents can't get out. And in fact, Dawn sends a text message to her other son, Josh, who lives down the street, saying, AJ tried to burn the house down. It's no surprise when you put it all together that he ended up in that bedroom shooting both his parents.
Defense attorney Rick DeToto says the 16-year-old is a victim in this case, not the perpetrator.
He's a great kid from a good family, and there's absolutely no motive why this happened. It doesn't make sense.
It was really a brilliant, I believe, move on the part of the defense attorney is to try this case out into the public before it ever hit the courtroom.
That created a feeling in the community of, is this kid being railroaded?
While A.J. Armstrong has the support of most everyone in his family, especially his grandparents, that same family turns on, surprisingly, another member of their very own family.
Josh recently had found out that Antonio was his stepdad. And when Josh found out that he was not biological to Antonio Sr., it affected him. According to the family, there was some jealousy with Josh, the way they were treating AJ and the way they were treating Kayra, and how he felt like he was kind of the black sheep of the family. So we presented Josh Armstrong as an alternative suspect in this case.
In the months leading up to the trial, A.J. Armstrong's defense lawyer, Rick DeToto, made all kinds of statements in the news that A.J.'s half-brother, Josh Armstrong, could be the true killer.
The defense's strategy was to present Josh as the black sheep of the family, the half-brother, not even fully related to Antonio Armstrong Sr., not blood.
Before the murders, they spoke every single day. They loved Josh, and Josh loved them. That was his real dad to him. Josh and I had been together for a little bit over a year before the murders. We met in college. We just connected so well. And probably within that month, we started dating. But Josh's behavior after the murders completely changed. At first, it was just depression, but then a week or two later is when I started seeing the paranoia come out. He felt that if somebody went after the parents, what's to stop them from going after him and I? I don't think that Josh knew his family was saying that he's the one who did it.
Despite all of the defense's theories that Josh Armstrong was the true killer, he was never truly considered a suspect by HPD because at the time of the murder, Josh always had a hard, firm alibi that he was with his girlfriend Hannah.
Lead prosecutor was John Brewer. He was assisted by Fareen Ansari and also Lester Blizzard. The prosecution leaned a lot into motive. They were trying to get into the mind of A.J. Armstrong. They are presenting a lot of evidence regarding grades and drug use and the taking away of vehicles, trying to pin basically the motive in front of the jury as to why A.J. Armstrong killed both of his parents.
He had failed out of the prestigious Kincaid School. His car was taken away from him and he couldn't see his girlfriend. To a teenager, that's their entire world.
The people who took all these things away from him, they ended up dead. Other than motive, the strongest evidence the prosecution has are his actions leading up to the murder. The prosecution is also presenting a lot of evidence regarding the alarm records.
The records said that the night of the murders, the alarm was set, the door was locked, there was no sign of forced entry.
So the prosecution was arguing because the alarm system was on and the records showed that no one came in or came out, that there was no way anyone else could have done it except for AJ. What they didn't know was that Josh had access to the house. And we had an alarm expert that could show that the way the zones were set up in that house, the door coming into the garage, if it was cracked, and we had testimony from the witnesses that that door frequently wouldn't close all the way, it would leave the front door open, meaning that you could open and close the door without the alarm going off. And we were able to call that expert during the trial to show that that's a problem with the alarm system in a way someone could get in and out and not trigger the alarm.
Even though it's unlikely that two doors would have been open at the same time so that the alarm wouldn't go off, the defense was able to point out that nobody had actually looked into that possibility because they said from the beginning, HPD zeroed in on AJ as their only suspect.
In 11 minutes of going into that house, before anything, they made up their mind, he did it. There's no physical evidence that ties AJ to the homicide. There's no DNA, there's no blood, there's no hair fibers, there's nothing. There's no blood on the gun, there's no blood in his room, there's no blood on his clothes. There was no physical evidence in a very bloody scene in the bedroom that linked AJ to the crime except his presence in the house.
The jury deliberates for several days and they're unable to reach a verdict. Trial comes back as a mistrial. There were 8 jurors who believed he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and there were 4 who didn't believe the state proved it beyond a reasonable doubt.
It was that trial team's belief that the jurors were saying, it's not like we don't think he did it, but there were people in the room that knew the consequences, that they were going to send someone to prison for the rest of their life on a crime they did at 16. And with the family supporting him and people believing in him, they just emotionally couldn't do it.
I was very relieved. Anytime our clients get to go home is a good day, but I also knew it was going to come back.
When a jury is hung and a mistrial is declared, the usual answer is, we're going to try it again. The difference in this case is that you have the family of the victims who also happen to be the family of the defendant. They do not believe the case should be tried again.
We can't move on with our lives, and we can't forget what we've been through.
With all that pressure coming to bear on the DA's office, what's going to happen next? When the trial against A.J. Armstrong for the murder of his parents was hung and a mistrial was declared, The DA's office makes the decision to try the case for a second time because when you have two people who are murdered and the state of the evidence points to one suspect, you're going to try that case again.
After that first trial, some of the trial team had gone to other DA's office, and so they were looking for a new team to try the case. I had picked up the case in between trial 1 and trial 2. I knew that it was a very contested case, and so I knew it was going to be an uphill battle when I took over the case.
And Ryan asked me to join him to try the case for the second trial.
This is already a very compelling case, and it's captured all of our attention. I'm especially paying attention to it because I know the lawyers so well. Both John Jordan and Rick DeToto worked at the DA's office, and I helped train them. John Jordan's style is a little more dramatic. He very much likes the whole theater courtroom part of a trial. And knowing those guys, they are both very ready to duke it out against each other in the courtroom.
I have a great deal of respect for Rick DeToto. He is a tremendous advocate. Juries love him. The problem is we had the truth on our side. We kind of went into the second trial even though we were kind of new. We didn't know the case like the defense team who had had it since day one. We're like, okay, well, we just have to get a better jury, and the evidence is great, and so we're going to try the case somewhat similarly, and we trust the evidence enough that we are confident that we're going to get a guilty verdict.
It's now 3 years later since the first trial, and in that time, A.J. Armstrong has grown up. He is now married to his longtime girlfriend, Kate. He has a son of his own. He looks a lot older. This is going to be a whole different kind of appearance that he portrays in front of a jury this time compared to last time.
In the opening statement, we recognize it's hard for rational, non-sociopathic people to get their head around the idea of what seems like normal teenage problems can lead to homicide. So what we did is we told the jury is you may never know why he did it, but you're going to be very confident and know he did it based on the evidence.
So we stuck to his actions, his words, and the alarm records.
In the first trial, the defense claimed that doors could be open and the alarm not go off. And it is the state's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the night of the murders, that house was secure.
The alarm system is complex. And what we learned is in the first trial, neither the state nor the defense had the complete records. They had records from ADT alarm system. ADT is the hardware side of this case, but they contract with a software company who monitors those records, and that company is Alarm.com. And so when we got Alarm.com's records prior to trial 2, we see now that there is way more activity that can be determined within the records, showing that nobody went in and out of the house and that the alarm system did not trigger, did not go off the night of the murders.
So we had an expert from ADT to explain the alarm.
My co-counsel, Chris Collins, was able to determine on cross-examination that there was a minimum of like 77 errors in the records of the alarm system. Chris was able to go step by step with that alarm expert and show to the jury that the records weren't accurate. And it was difficult to argue that no one could have gotten in and no one could have gotten out.
The defense really leaned into Josh in the second trial. In the first trial, they throw him out as a possible suspect. By the time trial 2 comes around, they have put all their cards in the Josh Armstrong basket as an alternate suspect.
What we brought to the second trial that we didn't bring in the first trial was we got additional records regarding the alternative suspects' mental health history, and these records were extremely detailed. We needed to present them to show the jury that the mental health issues occurred before the murders, not just after.
This is the only case I've ever tried in my career where we had to essentially be a prosecutor and a defense attorney in the same trial. We are fighting to convict somebody we know is guilty, and at the same time, fighting to exonerate somebody we know is innocent.
What we had to deal with in the second trial that the first team didn't is the court had ruled that they could put forward Josh Armstrong's mental illness as an alternative suspect theory. Not only did we have a very good expert witness to rebut that in a psychiatrist, but we had the person who knew Josh the best, his live-in girlfriend, Hannah Pallon.
Hannah Pallon testifies as to where Josh was the night of the murders, and she also provided a lot of correcting the things that the family was trying to portray about Josh.
I testified at the trial because I felt like I needed to be the one to say, this is all not right. Josh was never like this before this happened, before his parents were killed. There was never any sign of mental illness. There was no sign of depression. He had a bright future. He loved his family. And what AJ's lawyers did up there was disgusting.
Watching how all this played out, the way she brought it to life for the jury, the way she defended the honor of Josh, good for her. Good for her. I hope she's proud of herself, because we all are.
When the jury went out for deliberations in the second trial, I was as confident as I always am. And as the deliberations lingered and as it went on and on, started getting worried. They came back, they too could not reach a verdict. And I felt like I had been punched in the gut.
But this time it flipped and went from 8 not guilty to 4 guilty.
So when they came back and there were more jurors for not guilty than guilty, it was tough to recover from that.
It is. It's somewhat humiliating. We're going in the wrong direction. I mean, what are we doing here? It was devastating.
After that second trial ended in a hung jury, you have 2 prosecutors who've just lost trial number 2, and a decision has to be made. Do we try this case for a third time? The elected DA is the person who makes that decision. So when John Jordan and Ryan Trask made the commitment that they wanted to try this case a third time and do it again because they knew what the evidence was, that's the representation they made to their boss, and that's the decision that was made because they believed in this case.
But then there was a groundswell of supporters for AJ. Things started gaining momentum where people were like, enough is enough. Leave this kid alone. You sent your best prosecutors, you sent all your evidence, you sent hundreds of witnesses, you spent millions of dollars to go after this young man, and you can't get him. Let him go.
After that second trial ended in a hung jury, John Jordan and Ryan Trask made the commitment that they wanted to try this case a third time and do it again because they knew what the evidence was. But in the first trial, the split was 8-4 for guilty, and in the second trial, the split was 8-4 for not guilty. So the prosecutors knew they were facing even more pressure from the court of public opinion to try and make sure they got a verdict in the third trial.
We talked to some of the jurors, and sure enough, they told us the same thing that first jury said. That it's not that we don't believe in the evidence. It's that they didn't want to convict him, knowing the consequences of life imprisonment. That started our strategy for that third trial. We were going to do everything different because a fool does the same thing over and over again. So we were ready for the third trial and presenting our case in a very different way.
We had been to the Armstrong house several times, and one thing that John said to me the last time we went, he said, do you ever notice how narrow walking through this hall would be and how close the staircase is to the doors to the Armstrong's room? And John had a brilliant idea.
When I was a young prosecutor, I happened to actually be in the courtroom watching the Susan Wright trial, where Kelly Siegler brought the bed into the courtroom and demonstrated the crime.
And I attack at the head area first.
When A.J. Armstrong, in his statement to law enforcement that night, says he saw a masked man coming from his parents' bedroom as he was on the stairs, you can see how close in proximity he would have been to this alleged masked man is very important. So how do you do that? Well, you build a staircase.
We are taught at the DA's office to make the crime come alive in front of the jury. We all learn that. When you do that, you put the jury there. where they can't avoid seeing what happened.
When we were preparing for trial 3, we had solicited as one of the foremost experts in blood spatter as well as scene reconstruction, Shelley Rossi from the Montgomery County DA's office, who's helped me on cases before. She spent hours to take measurements and pictures, and she came in and she did all the measurements. So that staircase is the exact same dimensions. We placed the staircase away from the end of the jury box so they would see how close in proximity A.J. Armstrong would have been, if you believe his statement, on the staircase to this alleged made-up assailant who had a mask on. And so 2 things would have happened since it's so close, literally 3 feet and 3 inches, is 1, being that close, the assailant would have killed A.J. Armstrong and not allowed a survivor in the home. Or 2.
911, do you need medical, police, or fire?
I heard 2 gunshots downstairs in my pants room.
The very first words out of your mouth when you call 911 immediately afterwards was, "There's a masked man in my house."
Can't run from it was an excellent point by them.
In the very way that the first 2 juries tried to avoid that cold reality of how horrible this crime was, we were not going to let them do it. They were going to have to see it. They were going to have to confront it. Well, now we're going to bring the bedroom into the courtroom. So we set up a mock bedroom.
I thought it was important for the jury to see if there was an unknown intruder that came into the home in the middle of the night to retrieve Antonio Armstrong's firearm, that they would have to come into the bedroom, walk around the king-size bed over to the nightstand, go into the bottom drawer, remove the firearm, assume that it's loaded, come back around to Dawn's side of the bed, and fire 4 shots in the middle of the night. I think that out of all of the assumptions that it was an unknown masked intruder, to do that was just ludicrous.
Reconstructing the bedroom was straight out of the Kelly Siegler playbook. It's effective, but it's like show and lights and smoke and fog and mirrors. I think it was just over dramatic.
When John Jordan started to build out the stairwell and the bedroom, I heard all about it. I got a lot of text messages and phone calls. Guess what Jordan's doing? You know where he's getting it from. So, it makes me proud that he thought to do that.
6 inches each side.
I've been called dramatic and theatrical a few times in my life, but if it works and a jury understands what we're trying to say, then that's what matters.
After we presented the reconstruction of the crime scene, one of the things we decided to do differently was how we presented the alarm records. In the second trial, we had one representative, an expert from ADT, to explain the alarm.
What we learned in trial 2 is that because the expert from ADT did not understand the software from alarm.com, he did not have answers for some of the things that were being asked of him by the defense attorney on cross-examination. So in trial 3, we now bring the expert that understands all of the alarm records, Jason DaCosta, who was the VP for alarm.com. And we went through for hours, and we went through everything. And he testified to a lot of the things that the defense was trying to say to were errors in the alarm records. He could turn around and say, that's not an error. That's how the alarm records should be reporting. And so he was a great help to us in trial 3, bring the truth to the jury about what the alarm records really meant.
In closing, what I wanted the jury to feel was everything that I've tried to get them to feel in the first 2 trials. Police did a horrible job. They narrowed in on AJ, but I got really aggressive. This is a reckless prosecution. Only you can stop it. Only you can tell them enough is enough.
In closing argument, I used the alarm records. I tied in how voluminous those records were. And then I showed a text to the jury. It was something that Dawn had sent to her son, AJ, months before her murder. And it said, the alarm doesn't lie, you lie.
After 2 hung juries and an exhausting third trial, the prosecutors are making their final argument to the jury in closing statements.
Because this defendant has the ability to fool everybody, but he couldn't fool Mama.
Towards the end of my closing, since it became a decision for the jury, was it Josh or was it AJ? We ended it with what we truly believed.
I want to end this trial attempting to give a voice to Dawn. You are the only people in our community who, with your verdict, can exonerate my innocent son by holding my guilty one accountable. You could see her saying that.
It has been an emotional 1.5 years. And I told John, if he's not convicted on the evidence we just presented, it will never be good enough.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Antonio Armstrong Jr., guilty.
Our heart goes out to the family. We understand they're going through a lot. It's just their truth is not the truth, but our heart goes out to them because they are victims.
Because he was found guilty of capital murder is an automatic life sentence, and because he was 16 at the time of the crime, he'll be eligible for parole in 40 calendar years.
It's the worst moment of my career. It's a complicated emotion in that I know I fought my ass off for him. I gave a lot for that young man, but I still felt like I let him down.
Obviously, the work that all these lawyers did is pretty impressive. To be able to change their strategy based on how it played out in the last trial and move forward and stay so invested in this case speaks a lot to what good lawyers they are.
I think Antonio and Dawn would be proud of their son Josh. I even think they would forgive AJ for what he did because that's the kind of people Antonio and Dawn were. But I know Antonio and Dawn have to be proud of the fact that we're getting the truth.
I think Josh is the ultimate victim of these murders. And to be so compassionate for your family and believe that you are one of them, only to see what played out in those trials. I don't know how somebody recovers from something like that.
I'm sure he's seeing the news and seeing how he's being portrayed. Frankly, we think Dawn would have been appalled. And yes, it's 2 people who never met her, who is going into that courtroom, giving her a voice and holding the truth accountable and exonerating one son by convicting the other. Until the end of my career, I will be very proud of what we did to do that.
With AJ Armstrong finally being found guilty in the courtroom, I think the hope for all of us is that Josh can walk away knowing in his heart he didn't do anything wrong, and he can go try and live his best life without anybody in his family on his side. And that's going to be really hard for him to do, but I think that all of us really hope that he's able to do that.